The rain on the rim did not fall. It was beaten into the earth by a wind that seemed to hold a personal grudge against the world. It was a cold, stinging deluge that turned the ground into a churning slurry of gray clay and dead leaves. To the Empire, which controlled the stars and the neat, grid-like planets that orbited them, this place was an armpit, a backwater of no strategic value, inhabited only by those too stubborn to die and too poor to leave. But to Kalen, the mud was the only thing that felt real anymore. He stood in the doorway of his cabin, a structure built from the salvaged ribs of a troop transport and timber hewn from the choking ironwood forests. He wore a coat that had seen better decades, its leather scarred and stained, the waterproofing flacking off in patches. Underneath his body was a roadmap of past wars, old breaks in his knuckles, a shrapnel scar along his ribs that throbbed when the pressure dropped, and the burn mark that wrapped around his neck like a choker of faded fire. He wasn't checking the perimeter for invaders, he was watching the sky. The sky on the rim was usually a bruised purple heavy with toxic clouds, but today the clouds were tearing apart. "Stay inside," Kalen said softly, glancing back into the shadowed interior of the cabin. From a crate lined with thermal blankets, a pair of golden eyes blinked. They were vertical, reptilian, and currently filled with a confusion that tugged at something deep in Kalen's chest. The baby dragon, it was barely a week old, the size of a large hunting dog, sneezed. A puff of iridescent smoke, smelling faintly of cinnamon and ozone, curled into the damp air. Chirp, the sound was small, pathetic really. It was the noise a creature made when it expected warmth and found only the damp chill of a rainy afternoon. "I know," Kalen said, his voice rasping like gravel. "It's loud, just stay put. I'll handle the men in the shiny suits." He turned back to the deluge. He didn't want to go out there. His knees ached with a dull, constant fire, a reminder that he was 45 years old in a profession where 30 was considered ancient. He was tired of the war. He was tired of the Empire. He had fled to the rim to forget the sound of marching boots and the scream of fusion engines. But the Empire, as it turned out, had a very long memory. The sound changed from the roar of the wind to a thrumming, rhythmic vibration that shook the fillings in Kalen's teeth. It was a sound of absolute order imposing itself on chaos. He looked up just as the atmospheric stabilizers on the Imperial skiff engaged. The vessel broke the cloud layer. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a sleek dagger of chrome and glowing runes hovering effortlessly above the mud that threatened to swallow Kalen whole. It didn't touch the ground, it repelled it. The technology was Magi-Tech, the Empire's signature blend of ancient sorcery and hyper-advanced engineering. It represented a civilization that believed it had conquered nature, tamed magic, and cataloged every living thing in the universe. Except for the thing in Kalen's crate. The skiff descended slowly, the downwash flattening the wet grass against the earth. Kalen forced himself to breathe, to keep his hand loose at his side rather than clenching it into a fist. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Fear was chemical, he could burn it off. A ramp extended with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a snake uncoiling. First came the drones, small, spherical hovering automatons that scanned the area with red lasers. They swept over Kalen, analyzing his biological signature, assessing the threat level. Kalen knew exactly what they saw: human, male, sub-average muscle density, no cybernetic enhancements, threat level negligible. Then came the honor guards. Two cyborg dreadnoughts stepped down. They were massive, towering over 7 feet tall, their bodies encased in armor that shimmered with energy shields. Their faces were hidden behind obsidian visors, and their hands were replaced with weaponized multi-tools, plasma cutters, concussion launchers. They were the Empire's hammers, used to crack any nut that didn't crack itself. And finally, the High Commanders. Vex walked down the ramp as if he were walking on a marble floor in a palace. He wore a uniform of midnight blue, trimmed with gold braid that signified his rank within the Imperial Praetorian. He was tall, slender, with the sharp, high cheekbones of the aristocracy. He didn't wear a helmet, his hair was perfectly styled, immune to the wind and rain that battered Kalen. A faint, magical barrier shimmered around him, repelling the elements. He stopped 3 feet from Kalen. The distance was calculated, an assertion of dominance, close enough to intimidate, far enough to avoid contamination. "Kalen of the 9th Recon," Vex said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Or simply Kalen the Rat, as the criminal manifests designate you. Kalen didn't flinch, he looked Vex in the eye. "I haven't used that rank in 10 years, Vex, and I haven't been called Rat since I left the orphanage. Tell me, do they teach you how to insult people in officer school, or does it come naturally with the fancy uniform?" Vex's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We are here on official business, deserter. The Emperor's patience is not infinite." "Never is," Kalen said, spitting a stream of tobacco-tinged saliva onto the pristine mud near Vex's boots. "That's why empires fall. They run out of patience and forget to bring a lunch." Vex sighed, a long, suffering sound as if dealing with a tantrum-throwing child. He adjusted his gloves. We know you have it, Kalen. The biosignature is undeniable. An Apex-class thermal anomaly, unregistered and uncontrolled. You have a dragon. Kalen's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of indifference. I don't know what you're talking about. I hunt wild boar. Sometimes they run hot. Do not play the fool, Vex snapped, the veneer of politeness cracking for a split second. It is a hatchling, a biological weapon of mass destruction that was thought extinct. The Empire requires it. It is a creature of chaos, incapable of reason, a threat to the ordered peace of the galaxy. It belongs in a containment facility, not in a wooden box in the mud. Inside the cabin, the baby dragon let out a low, rumble growl. It felt the hostility in the air. Kalen shifted his weight. You call it a weapon, I call it a kid. You talk about ordered peace, but I've seen your peace, Vex. I've seen the worlds you've stabilized. You pave over the forests, you put the people in cubes, and you drain the magic until the planet is a gray husk. You don't want the dragon because it's dangerous. You want it because you haven't figured out how to control it yet. Vex stepped closer, the magical aura around him flaring. The Empire brings civilization to the savage stars. We elevate the primitive. And you are a relic. A human who refuses augmentation, who rejects evolution. You cling to your biology like a security blanket. It is pathetic. Vex gestured to the dreadnoughts. This is your chance to cease being a criminal and become a useful servant of the state. Surrender the beast, now, and we may overlook your desertion. You will be granted a transport to an agricultural colony. You can grow vegetables for the rest of your life. It is a mercy you do not deserve. The offer hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a good offer, logically speaking. Kalen was one man. He was old, tired, and outgunned. The baby dragon was just a creature. It wasn't his kin by blood. The Empire would kill him without hesitation. Surrendering was the smart choice. It was the human choice, the choice to survive at all costs. But Kalen thought about the way the dragon looked at him when he brought it scraps of meat. The trust in those golden eyes. The Empire saw a tool. Kalen saw something that had been born into a galaxy that wanted it dead simply for existing. He saw a reflection of himself, of humanity itself. The Empire had looked at Earth 500 years ago and seen a resource to be mined, soldiers for their wars, labor for their factories. They underestimated humans then. They thought they could break the spirit, breed the aggression out, turn them into obedient drones. They were wrong. Kalen looked at the dreadnoughts, their metal limbs gleaming. He looked at the sky, where the massive silhouette of the Imperial flagship was beginning to descend through the clouds, blotting out the sun. If he surrendered, the dragon would spend its life in a lab. They would cut it open, poke its brain, try to turn its fire into a fuel source. They would break it. And Kalen would grow vegetables and die in a bed, knowing he had traded a soul for his own comfort. I grow terrible vegetables, Kalen said. Vex blinked, confused by the non sequitur. What? My thumbs are black, Kalen continued, his voice dropping an octave, losing the rasp of age and gaining the iron edge of command. I tried to grow tomatoes once. They died. I'm no good at peace, Vex. I'm only good at one thing. And what is that? Vex asked, sneering. Making you bastards blood. Kalen reached into his coat. The movement was fast, practiced, muscle memory honed over 3 decades of guerrilla warfare. Kill him, Vex screamed, stepping back as the dreadnoughts raised their weapon arms. But Kalen didn't pull a gun, he pulled a flare. It was a crude chemical stick, the kind used by miners in the asteroid belts. He struck the head against the wet armor of his own coat. It flared to life, a brilliant, blinding crimson. He jammed it into the mud at his feet. The red light washed over the clearing, turning the rain into droplets of blood. You want the dragon? Kalen yelled, his voice roaring over the wind, amplified by sheer willpower. Come and take it. He looked at the dreadnoughts. They were targeting him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the tactical readout on his HUD. He'd managed to hack their local comms net 3 seconds ago. He knew their shield harmonics. He knew their blind spots. This is my home, Kalen shouted to the sky, to the Empire, to the universe. And I don't surrender. The air crackled. The moment of decision had passed. The Empire had the weight of history, the power of magic, and the strength of steel. But Kalen had something they didn't understand. He had nothing left to lose. Open fire, Vex shrieked, his face twisted in rage. Level the valley. Kalen didn't wait for the plasma to hit. He moved. He wasn't a super soldier. He didn't have hydraulic legs. But he had gravity and he had hate. He threw himself backwards, sliding through the mud toward the cabin, his hand finding the grip of his old vibro blade. Plasma bolts slammed into the ground where he had been standing, exploding the mud into shrapnel. The shockwave lifted him, throwing him against the cabin wall. He felt a rib snap, a sharp, hot pain, but he ignored it. He scrambled to his feet. The baby dragon was screaming now, a high-pitched keen of terror. Quiet, Kalen barked, vaulting over the crate. We're not dying today, kid, we're working. He grabbed his modified shotgun, a heavy, brutal weapon loaded with shells he'd crafted himself, enchanted with scrap runes and iron filings. The cabin door disintegrated under a hail of autocannon fire. Splinters flew like shrapnel. The dreadnoughts were advancing, step by heavy step, crushing the vegetation beneath them. Kalen looked at the dragon. The hatchling was trembling, its scales flushing a bright red. "You want to breathe fire?" Kalen asked, pumping the shotgun. "Now's the time to learn." He kicked the back door open. They were surrounded. The sky was dark with troop transports. The Empire had come with an army to take a baby. Kalen grinned. It was a feral thing, showing teeth that had been broken and reset years ago. "Empire," he muttered to himself, "you should have sent more droids." He chambered around. The sound was distinct, clack-clack, a sound that meant the negotiation was over. The Empire had ordered him to surrender. They had offered him peace. They had made the mistake of thinking a human, backed into a corner with nothing but a beat-up gun and a monster in a box, would choose survival over war. They didn't know humans. They didn't know that for humanity, war wasn't the last resort. It was the natural state. It was where they thrived. "All right," Kalen whispered to the dragon, "let's show them why they fear the dark." He stepped out into the rain, the thunder of the approaching army shaking the ground, and fired the first shot. The shotgun blast didn't just make a sound, it made a statement. It was a roar of defiance that shattered the rhythmic hum of the Imperial engines. The modified cartridge, a jagged mix of buckshot, iron filings, and a destabilized mana shard, didn't fly straight. It tumbled through the rain, a chaotic storm of metal seeking the warmth of living circuits and hydraulic fluid. It slammed into the lead dreadnought's chest plate. The Empire's energy shields were designed to repel coherent energy beams and high-velocity projectiles. They were not designed to handle a cloud of scrap metal charged with wild, unstable magic. The shield flared a brilliant, angry blue, sputtered, and died. The physical force of the blast knocked the 7-foot metal giant back a step. The iron filings, acting like shrapnel, bypassed the armor joints in the neck, shredding the synthetic muscle fibers and servos within. The machine didn't explode. It collapsed, spasming like a broken toy, its head lolling at an impossible angle, the red light in its visor fading to a dull gray. "One," Kalen grunted, the recoil of the weapon sending a jolt of pain through his already bruised shoulder. He didn't wait to see if the other one recovered. He turned, scooping up the squealing dragon hatchling with his free arm. The creature was warm, vibrating with a fear that matched his own. Its claws dug into his jacket, seeking purchase. "Hold on, kid," he gritted out, vaulting over the shattered remains of his kitchen table. The cabin disintegrated behind him. The second dreadnought, reacting with a speed that defied physics, raised its plasma cannon. A bolt of superheated green energy missed Kalen's head by inches, slamming into the wall of the cabin. The explosion blew out the back of the structure, sending wood, stone, and memories flying in a deadly cloud of debris. Kalen hit the mud hard, rolling, shielding the dragon beneath his body. He felt the heat singe his hair, smelled the ozone of the plasma blast mixed with the petrichor of the rain. He came up running, his boots finding no traction on the slick earth, fighting for every inch of forward momentum. He wasn't running away from the fight, he was running to where the fight could be won. The cabin was a death trap, a confined space where the Empire's superior firepower meant certain doom. But the woods were chaotic. The woods were messy. The woods were where big, expensive robots got stuck in roots and mud. "Target is mobile," a synthesized voice boomed from the sky, cutting through the thunder. "Designation hostile, priority exterminate, secondary recover package." "Package?" Kalen wheezed, ducking under a falling branch as the heavy weapon's fire tore through the tree line. "That's my kid, you scrap heaps." He scrambled over a fallen log, his lungs burning. The dragon was squirming in his arm, chirping frantically. "Jerb jerb hiss." "Not now," Kalen barked, sliding down a muddy embankment. "Wait for the signal." There was no signal. Kalen was improvising. He had been improvising since the day he was born in a refugee camp on the edge of the Empire's territory. Humans, the Empire said, were adaptable. It was their backhanded compliment, the one trait they grudgingly respected because they couldn't replicate it with code. Drones followed orders. Humans followed opportunity. Kalen reached the ravine he'd scouted 3 years ago when he bought the land. It was a natural choke point, a narrow fissure in the earth guarded by thick, gnarled roots and slick rock walls. He dropped into the shadows, pressing his back against the cold stone. He listened. The rain was his ally now, masking the sound of his ragged breathing. Above him, the heavy thud of the remaining dreadnought shook the ground. It was moving cautiously. The machine had analyzed the death of its twin. It was learning. Scanning sector, the machine droned. A red laser swept across the ravine mouth, missing Kalen by inches. Kalen held his breath. He looked down at the dragon. The hatchling was trembling, its golden eyes wide, looking up at him. There was an intelligence there, ancient and predatory, but currently overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sensory input. Look at me, Kalen thought, projecting every ounce of his will into the gaze. Be still. To his shock, the dragon stopped shaking. It seemed to lock onto his heartbeat, syncing its rhythm with his. It pressed its snout against his chest, closing its eyes. Kalen reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a primitive-looking device. A detonator hooked to a claymore mine he'd buried in the side of the ravine months ago, rigged to a tripwire he hadn't set yet. He didn't have time to set the wire. He looked up. The dreadnought was peering over the edge of the ravine, its sensor arrays sweeping the darkness. Evasive maneuver detected, the machine announced, calculating trajectory. Kalen smiled. It was a bloody, feral smile. Calculating this, he whispered. He didn't use the detonator. Instead, he whipped his shotgun up over his head and fired blindly into the side of the ravine wall above the dreadnought. The rock face, already unstable from the relentless rain and the vibration of the Imperial engines, sheared away. Tons of wet mud and boulders came crashing down. The dreadnought fired its plasma cannon, trying to vaporize the landslide, but it was too much. The weight of the earth crushed it, burying the machine in a suffocating tomb of sludge and stone. The explosion of the cannon as its power core ruptured lit up the ravine like a second sun. Kalen threw himself over the dragon, shielding the creature from the heat and the flying shrapnel. Silence returned save for the hiss of rain on hot rock. Kalen coughed, spitting mud. He pushed himself up. His left arm was numb. He'd taken a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder during the landslide. Blood was mixing with the rain, running down his arm in dark rivulets. "Two," he whispered. And he didn't celebrate. Survival was a zero-sum game, and he was currently losing by attrition. He was bleeding, tired, and low on ammo. The Empire had infinite resources. They had drones, troops, and magic. He had a shotgun, 3 shells, and a lizard that smelled like cinnamon. "We have to move," he told the dragon. The hatchling looked at the buried robot, then back at Kalen. It made a low, rumbling sound deep in its throat. It wasn't a growl of fear this time. It was a sound of curiosity. It reached out a clawed hand and poked Kalen's bleeding shoulder. The touch was gentle, surprisingly delicate. "Yeah, it hurts," Kalen said, climbing out of the ravine. "Focus on the bad guys, not the meat." High Commander Vex stood on the bridge of his assault skiff, hovering 500 feet above the treeline. His hands were clasped behind his back, his knuckles white. On the holographic display in front of him, the red icons representing his elite squad flickered and died. "One, then another's." "Report," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Signal lost from Unit Alpha," the tactical officer replied, his voice trembling. "Crushed by geological displacement. Signal lost from Unit Beta. Shields bypassed by improvised kinetic payload. Vital systems severed." Vex turned to the officer. The sheer audacity of it made him want to vomit. A human. A baseline, unaugmented human was dismantling Praetorian elite guard units using farming tools and mud. "He is a rat," Vex hissed, "and he is leading us into a maze." "He is heading for the old mining tunnels, sir," the officer pointed to a topographical map. "If he reaches the subterranean network, our sensors will be useless. The ore deposits in the mountains interfere with long-range tracking." Vex stared at the map. The mining tunnels, dark, cramped, ancient, they hadn't been used in centuries. "He wants to hide in the dark," Vex said, smoothing his uniform. "Very well, burn the forest down." "Oh, sir." "Scorch the earth," Vex commanded, his eyes hard. "Level the trees from orbit to the bedrock, drive him out, smoke him out. If he wants to act like a beast, hunt him like one, deploy the pyrodrakes." The bridge crew froze. "Sir, the pyrodrakes, they are experimental, they are unstable." "They are fire," Vex said, "and he is playing with a spark, extinguish him." Kalen smelled the fire before he saw it. It wasn't the clean, sterile burn of plasma. It was a chemical smell, napalm and alchemical accelerant. The rain sizzled and evaporated as massive fireballs rained down from the sky. The Empire wasn't trying to capture him anymore. They were trying to delete the map. "Run!" Kalen shoved the dragon forward. They broke through the tree line into a clearing that had once been a gravel pit. The entrance to the old mines was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, dark and inviting. Behind them, the forest was a wall of flame. The heat was intense, a physical pressure that pushed against Kalen's back. And from the fire they came. The pyrodrakes. They weren't robots, they were biological constructs, twisted abominations grown in vats to serve as attack dogs. They had 4 legs, leathery wings that were too small for real flight, and heads that were nothing but exposed muscle and rows of spinning, serrated teeth. They were wreathed in magical green fire that didn't burn them but burned everything else. 3 of them, each the size of a tank. They screamed, a sound of pure hunger, and charged. Kalen skidded to a halt at the mine entrance. He couldn't outrun these, he couldn't hide. He looked at the dragon. The hatchling was looking at the pyrodrakes. The baby dragon's eyes were glowing, not with fear but with recognition. These were things of magic just like it, but they were wrong. They were perversions. Kalen raised his shotgun, 2 shells left. "Come on then," he roared, standing between the baby and the monsters. "Let's see what you're made of." The first drake pounced, covering 20 feet in a heartbeat. Kalen fired. The shot caught the beast in the open mouth, blowing out the back of its skull. The momentum carried the corpse forward, slamming into Kalen and knocking him to the ground. He gasped, the wind knocked out of him. The weight of the dead beast pinned his legs. He smelled its rotting magic stench. The second drake was on him instantly. It opened its jaws, the green fire flaring in its throat, ready to incinerate him. Gerbil. The sound wasn't loud, but it was piercing. The baby dragon stepped over Kalen's chest. It was trembling, its scales flashing from dull gold to blinding white. It looked at the drake, and for a second the world seemed to stop. The baby opened its mouth. No fire came out. Instead, a shockwave of pure sonic force erupted from the hatchling. It wasn't a roar, it was a scream of dominance. The sonic blast hit the second drake in mid-pounce. The construct's fragile magical bindings that held its mutated form together shattered. The beast literally fell apart, muscle disconnecting from bone, wings shearing off in a gruesome display of biological disassembly. It hit the ground in a heap of wet, twitching meat. Kalen stared, his ears ringing. The baby dragon swayed, then collapsed onto his chest, exhausted. The third drake hesitated. It was an animal driven by instinct and cruel programming. It sensed a power greater than its own handlers. It growled, backing away. Kalen scrambled up, kicking the dead drake off his legs. He scooped up the baby, who was now unconscious, its breathing shallow. "Good kid," Kalen whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Real good kid." He ran into the mine entrance, the darkness swallowing them just as the napalm strike hit the clearing. Inside the mountain, the world was cool and still. Kalen moved by feel, his hand brushing against the rough rock walls. The air smelled of dust and old minerals. He walked for an hour, putting miles of rock between him and the burning world above. Finally, he stopped. He found a small alcove, a dead-end spur of the old mine that looked stable. He lowered the dragon onto a flat rock. He checked his injuries. His shoulder was a mess. His ribs were definitely cracked. He was covered in bruises and cuts. He applied field dressing, spray-on sealant, and a bandage made from a torn strip of his shirt. He sat down, his back against the wall, and looked at the creature. The baby dragon was waking up. It blinked its golden eyes, looking around the dark cavern. It chirped softly, nuzzling Kalen's hand. Kalen laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. "You did it," he said. "You tore that thing apart. I didn't know you could do that." The dragon looked at him. There was a profound intelligence in those eyes, deeper than any human's. It seemed to understand that they were linked now, not just by circumstance but by survival. The Empire had tried to take it and Kalen had said no. The Empire had tried to kill them and they had fought back together. "We aren't safe," Kalen said, the reality of their situation settling in. "Vex won't stop. He can't stop. He's the Empire. If he lets a human and a lizard beat him, it breaks the narrative. It breaks their illusion of control." He looked at his shotgun, empty. He pulled his knife. It was a simple combat knife, the edge chipped. It was all he had left. "So," Kalen whispered, testing the edge of the blade against his thumb, "what's the plan, General?" The dragon sneezed. A tiny spark, no bigger than a match head, floated in the air and landed on a piece of dry moss. It smoldered, then flared into a small, steady flame. The light illuminated the walls of the alcove. Kalen froze. The walls weren't just rock. They were covered in carvings, ancient, spiraling patterns that pulsed with a faint, residual energy. He had seen diagrams like this in the archives. This wasn't just a mine, it was a tomb. And the carvings depicted dragons, not the bioengineered monstrosities the Empire created, real dragons, flying, breathing fire. And beneath them, small, stick-figure humans, not as masters and not as slaves. As partners. The baby dragon walked over to the largest carving, a central spiral that dominated the wall. It placed its claw against the stone. The mountain groaned. Kalen felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. The air pressure dropped. The little flame on the moss turned from orange to blue. Kid," Kalen stood up, his hand tightening on his knife. "What are you doing?" The dragon didn't answer. It began to glow. The light started in its chest and radiated outward, illuminating the entire cavern. The carvings on the wall began to respond, lighting up in sequence, tracing a line down the tunnel deeper into the mountain. Kalen realized then that the Empire wasn't just hunting a pet. They were terrified of history. They had rewritten the galaxy to erase the time when humans and dragons ruled the stars together. They called it the Age of Myth and relegated it to fairy tales. But myths were just history that had the teeth to bite back. Above them, the ceiling of the mine cracked, dust sifted down. Kalen could hear the heavy thud of drilling equipment. The Empire was coming. They had brought excavation mechs. They were going to burrow into the mountain and root them out. Kalen looked at the light, then back at the darkness of the tunnel where the enemy was coming from. He was tired, he was broken, he was one man. But he looked at the dragon, the ancient fire burning in its eyes, and he felt a strange sensation. It wasn't hope. Hope was for people with a plan, it was certainty. The certainty that if he was going to die, he was going to die, making the Empire regret the day they learned the word surrender. "All right," Kalen said, turning toward the tunnel, standing between the dragon and the approaching dark. "Let's go introduce them to the locals." He didn't know how to fight an army with a knife, but he had a dragon that could scream things apart and a mountain full of ancient, waking magic. He grinned into the dark, the blood from his forehead running into his eye, turning the world a hazy red. "Empire," he muttered, "come and get it." The drill bits broke through the wall 50 yards ahead, the roar of machinery filling the ancient silence. Kalen spat on the ground, raised his knife, and took a stance that hadn't been taught in 1,000 years. The war for the rim had just begun. The sound of the mountain dying was not a roar but a scream. It was the grinding of million-year-old granite against titanium carbide teeth. It was the shriek of ancient magic fraying under the pressure of industrial science. High above, the Empire's excavation drills had breached the crust, and now the very spine of the world was being harvested. Kalen stood in the center of the glowing chamber, the light from the ancient carvings pulsing against his weary face. He was a ruin of a man, blood soaked through the bandages on his shoulder, his breath rattling in lungs that felt like they were filled with broken glass. His vibro blade was little more than a shard of metal with a handle, the edge chipped from hacking through imperial alloy. Behind him, the baby dragon sat on its haunches. It was no longer shivering. It was vibrating, humming with a frequency that made Kalen's bones ache. Its scales were shifting from gold to a deep, angry crimson, the color of a heart beating too fast. The carvings on the wall seemed to be reaching for it, lines of light stretching out like spectral fingers to stroke the creature's flanks. "You're doing it," Kalen rasped, not turning around. He didn't dare take his eyes off the tunnel mouth where the wall was beginning to bulge. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster." The wall exploded inward. It didn't crumble, it was punched through. A massive cylindrical drill head, easily 20 feet in diameter, tore through the rock, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. Behind it came the Empire's shock troopers, mechanized infantry in heavy environment suits. They moved with the synchronization of a hive mind, their weapons raised. And behind them, floating into the cavern on an anti-grav sled, was High Commander Vex. Vex looked around the chamber, his lip curled in disgust. He saw the carvings, the glowing light, the primitive aesthetic of it all. He saw Kalen standing alone in front of the dragon, a single bleeding obstacle in the path of progress. "Pathetic," Vex's voice boomed, amplified by the external speakers of his sled. "Even now you cling to superstition. You think these cave drawings will save you." Kalen spat blood onto the stone floor. "I think they make the place look homey, better than your chrome coffins." "Kill him," Vex ordered, bored. "Secure the specimen, the Emperor wishes to dissect it personally." The squad of 30 troopers raised their rifles. Kalen didn't charge, he knew he wouldn't make it. He didn't have a super soldier serum in his veins, he didn't have a shield generator. He had only the one thing the Empire could never replicate, the absolute refusal to quit. He crouched. "Hold the lines," he whispered to the empty air. "Hold." The word wasn't spoken, it was felt. The dragon behind him opened its mouth. No fire came out. Instead, the sound Kalen had heard in the cabin but magnified 1,000 times, erupted. It wasn't just a noise, it was a wave of force, a hammer blow of pure air pressure. The front rank of troopers was lifted off their feet and slammed backward into their comrades. The shockwave shattered the sensors on their helmets, crumpled chest plates, and sent the heavy drill rocking on its mounts. Dust and small stones flew through the air like shrapnel. The roar stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The dragon slumped, exhausted, the light on its scales dimming. Kalen moved. While the Empire was disoriented, Kalen was chaos. He sprinted forward, not at the troopers, but at the drill mechanism itself. He was a blur of tattered leather and determination. He scrambled up the side of the massive machine, his boots finding purchase on the hydraulic hoses and service ladders. A trooper spotted him and fired, a plasma bolt grazing Kalen's side, searing through his coat and burning the skin beneath. He didn't flinch. Pain was just data, data he could ignore. He reached the main hydraulic manifold. It was the size of a man's torso, pulsing with the pressure required to turn the diamond-tip drill. "You want the dragon?" Kalen screamed, driving his broken vibroblade into the manifold with both hands. "Come dig him out." The blade pierced the housing. Fluid exploded outward under immense pressure, spraying the troopers below. The drill shrieked, a high-pitched mechanical death wail as its gears locked up. The massive head ground to a halt, shattering the bit and sending a shower of sparks into the cavern. Kalen leapt from the machine as it listed to the side, crashing into a squad of troopers. He landed in a roll, coming up with his stolen sidearm, a plasma pistol taken from a dead trooper in the woods. He fired 3 shots, 3 helmets, 3 kills. Then the weapon clicked empty. He threw the pistol at the next trooper, the futile projectile bouncing off the armor. They were recovering now. The initial shock of the dragon's roar had faded. The training took over. They were regrouping, aiming their weapons, calculating the firing solution for the crazy human. "Enough," Vex shouted. He floated higher, his personal shield flaring. "I tire of this theatrics. Target the human, full power." 30 plasma rifles raised in unison. It was a firing squad, the end of the line. There was no cover, there was no escape. Kalen stood there, bleeding, swaying on his feet. He looked back at the dragon. The hatchling was looking at him. It wasn't looking at the troopers. It was looking at him. It was asking a question. "Are we finished?" Kalen looked at the carvings on the wall. He remembered the spiral pattern. He remembered the stick-figure humans standing beside the dragons. They weren't kneeling. They weren't holding leashes. They were standing side by side. The Empire thought dragons were engines of destruction. They thought they were batteries or bombs, but Kalen understood now, looking into those golden eyes. Dragons were amplifiers. A mage uses magic to cast a spell. A dragon uses magic to be. But a dragon needs a direction. A dragon needs a will to focus the fire. Kalen was the will. "No," Kalen said, facing the guns. "We are not finished." He closed his eyes. He reached out with his hand, not physically, but with the part of his mind that had always been stubborn, the part that refused to die in the mud, the part that had held onto the dragon when the whole galaxy said let go. Burn them, Kalen thought, projecting every ounce of his rage, his love for the wild, his hatred of the cages into the mental link. Burn the sky. The Empire's arrogance was their greatest weakness. They believed magic was a math equation. They believed if you brought enough shielding, enough armor, you could negate anything. They were wrong. The dragon stood up. It spread its wings, small, useless things for flight but perfect channels for energy. It sucked in the air, the cavern wind howling into its maw. The carvings on the walls exploded with light. The ancient runes flared brighter than the sun, pouring millennia of stored starlight into the small body of the hatchling. Vex saw it. He saw the energy readings on his HUD spike into the red zone, then break the sensor. He saw the magical barriers on his sled flicker and fail. "Abort fire, fire now," Vex screamed, his voice cracking for the first time. They fired. 30 plasma bolts screamed across the distance. And they stopped. In midair, inches from Kalen's chest, the bolts slowed, spun, and dissolved. A shield had formed around Kalen, not a technological one, but one of fire and will. The dragon opened its mouth and the roar came again. But this time it wasn't sound. It was a beam of pure, annihilating energy. It was gold, blinding, and hotter than a supernova. It hit Vex's sled first. There was no explosion, there was only evaporation. The metal, the plastic, the flesh, the arrogance, it all turned to mist instantly. The beam continued, piercing the ceiling of the cavern, tearing through tons of rock as if it were paper. Kalen watched, his face illuminated by the terrible beauty of it. He felt the heat, but it didn't burn him. He felt the power coursing through the link between them. He was steering the ship. He was the rudder and the dragon was the ocean. The beam punched through the mountain, erupting into the stormy sky above. The clouds were blown away for 100 miles in every direction. The rain vaporized instantly, creating a dome of steam. And above them, the Empire's flagship, the Indomitable, hung in the now clear air. It was a city-sized weapon, a moon of steel and magic. It had already begun to charge its main planetary bombardment cannon to glass the valley. The dragon saw it, the dragon felt the threat. The dragon was tired, the attack on the cavern draining its life force, but the rage was bottomless. More, Kalen thought, his hand reaching out toward the hole in the roof. "Give me everything." The hatchling screamed. It sounded like a tear in the fabric of reality. The beam of gold fire split. It widened, turning into a cone of destruction that reached up higher, engulfing the descending dropships, vaporizing the drones, and slamming into the belly of the Indomitable. The Empire's flagship had shields that could withstand nuclear bombardment. They had arcane wards woven by the greatest sorcerers in the galaxy. Against the breath of an ancient, awakened and directed by human spite, they were paper. The gold fire washed over the ship. The shields didn't just break, they shattered. The hull didn't melt, it sublimated. Fire cascaded through the corridors, through the bridge, through the engine rooms. The great ship groaned, a sound of metal screaming in agony, and began to break apart. It didn't crash downwards, it disintegrated. Debris rained down, burning up in the atmosphere, falling as harmless ash. The beam cut out. The dragon collapsed. It fell to the stone floor, shrinking, its scales turning back to a dull, weary gold. It lay still, its chest barely moving. Kalen fell to his knees. The connection severed, leaving him feeling hollow, cold, and empty. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He crawled to the dragon, he put his ear to the creature's chest. Thump thump, slow but steady. "Good kid," Kalen whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and blood on his face. "You showed them." The dust began to settle. The troopers who had survived the energy backlash stood frozen. Their commanders were dead. Their ship was gone, their HUDs were offline. They were standing in a primitive cave facing a wounded human and a sleeping monster. Kalen stood up, it took him 3 tries. His legs were trembling, his body was screaming for him to lie down and die, but he wasn't done yet. He looked at the troopers, he picked up his broken vibroblade. "Leave," Kalen said, his voice was quiet, but in the silence of the tomb it carried. "Get off my planet, take your drills, take your dead, go." The troopers looked at each other. Without their link to the Empire, without the constant stream of orders, they were just men in metal suits. They looked at the wreckage of Vex's sled. They looked at the hole in the roof that led to the wreckage of their pride. One by one, they lowered their weapons. They began to retreat, backing away slowly, then turning and running, clambering over the broken drill, fleeing into the dark tunnels. Kalen watched them go. He didn't chase them, he didn't kill them. They weren't the enemy, they were just the screws in the machine. He had broken the machine. He sat back down heavily next to the dragon. He leaned his head back against the ancient carvings. He thought about the Empire. They would be back, eventually. They would send a fleet. They would send a legion. They would never forgive the humiliation. But that was a problem for future Kalen. Present Kalen looked at the dragon. The hatchling opened one eye, the golden orb dim but aware. It nudged Kalen's hand with a wet snout. It chirped. A small puff of smoke, real smoke this time, smelling of campfires and safety, curled into the air. Kalen laughed. It hurt, but he did it anyway. "We did it," he said. "We started the war." He looked up at the hole in the ceiling. The storm had broken. Actual, real sunlight was filtering down through the gaps in the vaporized clouds. It was warm. Humanity had surrendered to the Empire for centuries. They had traded their freedom for safety, their heritage for comfort. They had forgotten how to roar. Kalen looked at the dragon, and the dragon looked at him. "I don't know about you," Kalen said, pushing himself to his feet one last time, scooping the heavy hatchling into his arms. "But I'm starving. Let's go see if anything edible survived the fire." He walked toward the daylight, carrying the weight of the future in his arms. The Empire had ordered him to surrender. They hadn't specified what he was supposed to surrender. They thought it was the dragon. They were wrong. He had surrendered his fear. He had surrendered his chains. And in exchange, he had chosen war. He walked out of the mountain, into a world that was on fire, under a sky that was clearing, and he smiled. The galaxy was going to have to learn to fear the mud and the scales again. The long night was over, the dawn was coming, and it was going to burn gold.